We are taught from childhood that the Great Flood was an absolute reset, a flawless planetary sterilization designed to wash away the corrupted celestial and human hybrid bloodlines known as the Nephilim. The story we all know insists that every living thing outside the wooden hull of Noah's Ark perished in the rising waters, wiped clean from the terrestrial plane. But what if the ultimate mechanism of divine judgment was actually incomplete? What if the historical and theological narrative of the ancient Near East is haunted by a suppressed, darker continuity, a genetic anomaly that defied the wrath of the heavens? Genesis 6:4 introduces an inescapable and terrifying ontological paradox, stating plainly that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. This single line shatters the illusion of a total eradication, demanding a rigorous explanation for how such a colossal anomaly could possibly survive the apocalypse. The answer lies hidden in the obscure layers of Talmudic lore, midrashic texts, and fringe archaeology, all pointing to a singular, terrifying biological vector. His name was Og, the Amorite king of Bashan, and he was not merely a monarch of unusual size, but the ultimate biological relic of the pre-flood epoch. He was the final pure-blooded anchor of the Watcher lineage, the patriarch of a dark underworld culture, and the parasite that hitched a ride on the very instrument of human salvation. But the true horror of his survival is not just that he lived, but how he survived, and what his existence implies about the resilience of ancient, chaotic genetics. To truly grasp the sheer impossibility of Og's survival, you have to understand the physical reality of the catastrophic event known as the Great Deluge. This was not merely a staggering volume of water slowly covering the mountains, but a lethal, violent eruption of the deep. Ancient rabbinic literature transforms this narrative from a simple myth into a complex and gruesome mechanical problem, focusing on a terrifying detail. The water was boiling. The generation of the flood was condemned for its hot passion, and in a terrifying manifestation of divine poetic justice known as Gevurot Geshamim, the subterranean waters that erupted from the earth were literally boiling hot. The sky did not just rain, it poured scalding judgment, meaning that survival by simply treading water or clinging to floating debris was a physical impossibility. Any organic matter exposed to this deluge would be instantly boiled alive, reducing the world outside the ark to a horrific, bubbling cauldron of cooked flesh and screaming ruin. You have to picture the ark not as a peaceful menagerie floating on calm blue seas, but as a claustrophobic, pitch-black submarine adrift on a boiling, corpse-choked ocean. Inside, Noah and his family were sealed away from the incinerating wrath of the Elohim, surrounded by the deafening roar of the apocalyptic storm and the suffocating heat of the waters outside. Yet amidst this boiling sterilization, a highly localized suspension of physical laws occurred, an anomaly that permitted the unthinkable. The Talmud, specifically in Tractate Zevachim 113b, posits that a localized miracle cooled the waters immediately adjacent to the exterior of Noah's Ark. This created a narrow, fragile thermal sanctuary, a sliver of survivable temperature in which the giant could exist without being incinerated. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Chapter 23 expands upon the grim logistics of this survival protocol, depicting Og not as a majestic survivor, but as a desperate, parasitic entity physically anchored to the exterior of the colossal vessel. He is described as sitting upon a wooden plank or a ladder rung positioned directly beneath the guttering of the ark, gripping the pitch-sealed wood as the boiling waves crashed just inches from his feet. Some traditions emphasize his sheer, incomprehensible physical mass, suggesting his giant stature allowed the waters to reach only his ankles. But the terror remains the same. He was not a permitted passenger. He was a biological contaminant clinging to human salvation, shivering in the cooled anomaly of the waters while suspended above an abyssal, boiling sea. Imagine the psychological toll on the inhabitants of the ark, hearing the deep, resonant, and unnatural breathing of a Nephilim entity through the thick wooden walls, knowing that the very nightmare the flood was meant to destroy was right outside. But survival in a sterilized, flooded world requires more than just evasion of the heat. It requires sustenance, which presents an absolute logistical impossibility. The earth was drowned, its resources boiled away, leaving Og facing slow starvation, even if the waters didn't claim him. To secure his biological preservation, a dark and desperate pact was struck amidst the torrential, catastrophic rains. Og swore a binding oath to Noah and his descendants, pledging eternal servitude in exchange for the calories needed to keep his colossal frame alive. In response to this desperate bargain, Noah did something unimaginable. He physically altered the divine architecture of the ark. According to the texts, Noah bored a specific aperture, a narrow trap-door or hole, straight through the pitch-sealed hull of the sacred vessel. Through this claustrophobic opening, Noah passed daily rations of food out into the storm, directly sustaining the very genetic corruption the flood was designed to eradicate. This single profound act frames Noah not merely as the savior of humanity, but as the unwitting preserver of an antediluvian horror. Visualize the sheer terror of Noah's family approaching that dark aperture, sliding meager rations through the splintered wood, perhaps catching a glimpse of a massive gray hand or a glowing, desperate eye in the freezing rain. By feeding the giant, Noah ensured that Og became the ultimate biological relic, a living museum of the drowned world, carrying the suppressed knowledge and corrupted genetics of the pre-flood epoch straight into the virgin, post-flood reality. The obliteration was compromised, and the seeds of a dark, giant-ruled kingdom were carefully preserved on the very side of the boat meant to usher in a clean earth, setting the stage for a brutal terrestrial empire that would rise from the black rocks of the Levant. The boiling, apocalyptic waters of the Great Deluge eventually began to recede, leaving behind a sterilized, unrecognizable world, suffocating under an endless expanse of thick, foul-smelling mud. The earth was a graveyard of drowned empires and cooked flesh, meant to be a clean slate for the surviving remnants of humanity. But as the heavy, pitch-sealed door of the ark finally groaned open, the biological contagion that had desperately clung to the exterior of the vessel stepped down into the sludge. Og of Bashan, the immortal parasite, had survived the incinerating wrath of the Elohim, and he now looked upon a virgin terrestrial plain ripe for conquest. To comprehend the sheer, unadulterated power wielded by this entity in the centuries that followed, one must first step into the oppressive, suffocating topography of his chosen dominion. Ancient Bashan, a sprawling territory corresponding to the modern Golan Heights and extending far east to the Haran, was bordered by the rushing waters of the Yarmouk River to the south and the imposing snow-capped peak of Mount Hermon to the north. This was absolutely not a land of flowing milk and honey, nor was it a welcoming paradise for a fragile, recovering human race. It was a formidable, deeply militarized landscape, characterized by the jagged, broken teeth of inactive volcanic cones and vast, impenetrable layers of light-absorbing, black basalt rock. The terrain was incredibly harsh, forbidding, and conceptually linked by the ancient mind to the dark, bottomless depths of the underworld. Picture an environment where the very ground seems to violently swallow the golden sunlight of the Levant, casting unnaturally long, cold shadows even at high noon. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the scent of sulfur and ancient dust. It was a kingdom of black stone, perfectly suited for a civilization of biological anomalies, a desolate expanse that mirrored the cold, calcified heart of its giant king, serving as a bleak canvas upon which Og would construct an empire built strictly for inhabitants of superhuman scale. Within the fortified heart of this black basalt kingdom rested an artifact so terrifying in its implications that the biblical authors felt compelled to preserve its exact dimensions as a permanent, chilling warning to all future generations. The Book of Deuteronomy, chapter 3, verse 11, provides the most famous and analytically significant metric of King Og's horrifying physicality, stating with cold precision that his bedstead was a bedstead of iron, measuring 9 cubits in length and 4 cubits in breadth. When we strip away the ancient terminology and employ the standard ancient cubit of approximately 18 inches, the physical dimensions of this dark artifact become genuinely staggering to the modern mind. The object measured roughly 13.5 feet in length and exactly 6 feet in width. While conservative antiquarian scholars might desperately attempt to argue that this bedstead was merely an oversized piece of decorative furniture meant for royal display, its sheer, crushing mass and the biblical insistence on recording it as a prime trophy of war points to a much more terrifying biological reality. It indicates a living, breathing entity whose standing stature comfortably exceeded 10 to 11 feet in height. This colossal frame easily doubled the height of an average Bronze Age human warrior, casting a literal giant shadow over anyone who dared approach the throne, and perfectly aligning with ancient Near Eastern descriptions of extreme, genetically anomalous warriors. But the true esoteric significance of this massive artifact lies not just in its colossal size, but in the specific, highly unusual material composition, carefully noted by the ancient scribes. For the text specifically and deliberately highlights that it was forged entirely of iron. You must transport yourself back to the technological reality of the late Bronze Age, around the era of 1400 BCE, a time when iron was absolutely not a common utilitarian material used for everyday tools or simple weapons. In this ancient epoch, iron was an extreme rarity, a substance transitioning slowly from an exotic curiosity to an elite, closely guarded symbol of occult and absolute royal power. Smelting terrestrial iron requires extraordinarily high temperatures, demanding a complex metallurgical technology that was still in its absolute infancy during this period. Consequently, the highest-grade iron items from the Bronze Age, such as the weapon-grade dagger found hidden in the burial wrappings of Tutankhamun, were not pulled from the dirt. They were frequently forged from meteoric iron, a dark, heavy, and alien material that quite literally fell burning from the heavens. In the complex and highly spiritual mythologies of the ancient Near East, including deep Hittite and Egyptian cosmologies, Specific precious metals were assigned direct biological correspondence to the divine form. Gold was widely considered to be the glowing flesh of the gods, while iron and silver were deeply revered as the unbreakable bones of the gods. Furthermore, in the ancient Ugaritic alphabetic cuneiform texts, iron holds a heavy, oppressive, ritualistic, and divine weight. Therefore, King Og's iron bedstead was absolutely not merely a piece of oversized domestic furniture used for a giant's slumber. It was a cultic throne, a massive, heavy sarcophagus, or a ritual dais crafted from a metal intrinsically associated with celestial descent and divine anatomy. Imagine the deafening, rhythmic ring of massive hammers striking meteoric rock in the dead of night, the blinding, searing heat of the enormous forges, and the choking smell of ash as the Rephaim painstakingly shaped the bones of fallen stars to physically anchor the enormous, anomalous physical mass of their immortal monarch to the earth. The architectural legacy of this giant civilization extends far beyond a single iron throne, manifesting physically in one of the most enigmatic, labor-intensive, and chilling megalithic anomalies in the entire Levant. Hidden away upon a vast, desolate basalt plateau in the Golan lies Rujum el-Hiri, translated from Arabic as the stone heap of the wildcat, but known in the ancient Hebrew tongue as Gilgal Rephaim, the wheel of the giants. From the ground level, it appears as a chaotic, impenetrable jumble of dark rocks, but from an aerial perspective, a terrifyingly precise geometric pattern emerges from the barren earth. The massive site consists of an estimated 40,000 tons of unhewn, light-absorbing black basalt fieldstones that have been meticulously gathered and stacked into 5 to 9 massive concentric rings. The sheer scale of the construction is dizzying, with the outermost ring measuring a staggering 520 feet in diameter and standing a solid 8 feet in height. At its exact mathematical and geographical center lies a massive burial cairn, a tumulus towering 15 feet into the sky like a dark monument to a forgotten god. Dating back to the early Bronze Age, this colossal structure aligns perfectly with the sunrise of the summer solstice, suggesting its dual use as an advanced, precision-engineered astronomical observatory and a sprawling, open-air ritual center dedicated entirely to the dark cult of the dead. To construct such a monument required an estimated 25,000 working days of back-breaking labor, dragging rough volcanic rock across the jagged plateau. It is a scale of labor that heavily implies the existence of a highly organized, dominating, and physically terrifying ruling class that forced its will and its grand, esoteric architecture upon the terrified surrounding human populations. Yet the most deeply unsettling aspect of the Wheel of the Giants is not the stone itself, but rather what modern archaeologists have completely failed to find there. Despite the undeniable, imposing presence of the central burial tomb and decades of searching, extensive modern excavations have yielded almost no human remains within its ancient circular walls. This startling and eerie absence of bone has given rise to the excarnation theory, a grim, highly visceral, and horrifying framework proposed by leading archaeologists studying the site. According to this blood-chilling theory, the massive concentric basalt rings did not serve as a permanent resting place or a traditional cemetery. Instead, They functioned as a massive open-air processing facility for the deceased giants of the Rephaim. The bodies of the Rephaim elite, monstrous in their proportions and heavy with dense muscle and thick bone, were carried up to the high plateau, placed upon the cold, heat-absorbing black stones, and left completely exposed to the elements. Imagine the sky suddenly darkening with massive, swirling flocks of vultures, the deafening sound of tearing flesh and snapping tendons echoing across the empty plateau, as the wildlife systematically defleshed the colossal corpses under the scorching, unrelenting Levantine sun. Once the bodies were stripped completely bare, the clean, gigantic bones were carefully and ceremonially gathered by the cult priests for final interment elsewhere, hidden away in massive stone bone boxes or deep subterranean dolmens scattered across the landscape. Gilgal Rephaim stands today as a dark, cyclical monument to a civilization that obsessively tracked the movements of the heavens, while simultaneously venerating the absolute darkest aspects of the abyss. It is a physical echo of a nightmare that survived the boiling flood, a kingdom constructed of rock, iron, and blood that proves the giants did not merely exist in the shadows. They ruled the ancient world with an absolute, terrifying supremacy. To classify King Og of Bashan merely as a physically imposing giant, a biological freak of nature, or an evolutionary anomaly, is to fundamentally misunderstand his terrifying ontological status in the ancient world. History has a habit of reducing its monsters to simple brutes, stripping away their complex, chilling origins to make the stories easier to digest. But Og was not simply a large man who managed to survive a catastrophic flood. He was the culmination of a dark, meticulously preserved genealogy that traces its origin off-planet, pointing directly to the catastrophic celestial incursions described in the shadowy pages of the Book of Enoch and echoed in the most obscure corners of ancient Talmudic lore. To uncover the true source of his power, we must look away from the black basalt fortresses of the Levant and cast our gaze upward to the snow-capped, freezing summit of Mount Hermon. It was here, in the forgotten mist of the antediluvian epic, that the celestial boundaries were violently shattered. 200 luminous, terrifying entities, known as the Grigori, the Watchers, descended from the heavens, abandoning their divine posts. Led by the infamous Azazel and the paramount commander Shemhazai, these angels did not come to observe. They came to consume and to corrupt. They looked upon the daughters of men and took them as wives, initiating an illicit, unnatural union that poisoned the human genome. According to ancient rabbinic texts like Tractate Nida, Og was not just a descendant of this event, he was explicitly and genetically identified as the direct grandson of Shemhazai himself. He was the literal flesh and blood of a fallen star, carrying the raw, undiluted genetics of the celestial architects who plunged the early world into utter chaos. But the Watchers did not merely corrupt the human genome with hybrid DNA. They initiated an esoteric, civilization-altering transmission of forbidden celestial technologies that forever changed the trajectory of human history. Before this catastrophic incursion, the Earth was relatively quiet, but the Book of Enoch explicitly details how Azazel decided to teach humanity the dark arts of metallurgy. He showed them how to extract hidden metals from the deep veins of the earth and forge them in blistering, suffocating heat. Try to imagine the sheer terror and awe of the first human holding a polished bronze sword, the reflection of the forge fire dancing in the lethal edge, or the heavy, impenetrable weight of a crafted breastplate and shield. The Watchers weaponized humanity, handing them the blueprints for mass slaughter and sophisticated warfare. Og's colossal iron bedstead, his impenetrable basalt architecture, and his heavily militarized kingdom of Bashan were not the crude inventions of a primitive giant clan. They were the direct inheritances of this Watcher legacy. Og was the literal progeny of the architects of war, wielding occult technologies and metallurgical secrets meant only for the heavens. The impenetrable fortresses he commanded and the meteoric iron he slept upon were the physical manifestations of a suppressed extraterrestrial knowledge that had somehow survived the boiling waters of the Great Deluge, kept alive in the memories and the blood of its final ruling patriarch. This terrifying lineage explains why the biblical texts refer to Og as the last of the remnant of the Rephaim, a term that has been systematically sanitized and stripped of its true horror over thousands of years. In standard modern biblical translations, the word Rephaim is often lazily rendered simply as giants, or as weak, powerless shades of the dead wandering aimlessly in the dusty underworld of Sheol. The biblical authors deliberately stripped the Rephaim of their agency in death, presenting them as impotent shadows in order to mock the legendary heroes of antiquity and assert the absolute, unchallenged supremacy of their own deity. But the Canaanite and Amorite precursors to the Israelites did not view the Rephaim with mockery. They viewed them with a profound, paralyzing dread and deep religious reverence. When we dig into the alphabetic cuneiform tablets recovered from the ancient, ruined Syrian port city of Ugarit, buried under the sands since 1400 BCE, the cognate term reveals a much darker, more potent theology. In the Ugaritic corpus, the Rephaim are absolutely not feeble ghosts. They are an elite aristocratic class of deified dead kings, ancient warrior heroes, and semi-divine inhabitants of the netherworld. They were not mindless, lumbering brutes. They were a highly organized, sophisticated death cult that straddled the terrifying threshold between the land of the living and the abyss of the dead. The ancient rituals dedicated to these beings reveal a civilization completely obsessed with necromancy and underworld communion. Consider the chilling royal funerary liturgy recovered from Ugarit, a text detailing a dark ceremony enacted for the recently deceased King Nikmadu III. The ritual does not pray for the king's peaceful rest. Instead, it explicitly summons the ancient holy ones from the dirt. The priests chanted into the heavy incense-choked air, calling upon the legendary kings of old to rise physically from the underworld and rendezvous with the new monarch's throne. Even more disturbing are the Marzia banquets, described in fragmentary but vivid tablets, where the supreme god El hosts a massive, lavish drinking feast that lasts for 6 uninterrupted days. The Rephaim are summoned to this feast alongside terrifying underworld divinities. The texts describe these deified giant kings traveling for 3 days on massive horse-drawn chariots, the ground shaking beneath their wheels as they ascend from the darkness to partake in the wine of ecstasy. In this ancient theology, the Rephaim were the dark patrons of royal dynasties, lords of the dead who still exerted a heavy, tangible power over the waking world. Synthesizing the Enochic descent of the Watchers with the dark Ugaritic theology reveals the true esoteric significance of King Og. As the last of the Rephaim, Og was far more than just the final ruler of a specific ethnic clan of large men. He was a threshold entity, a creature existing in two worlds simultaneously. He was the terminal node of the Watcher bloodline, the final, pure-blooded terrestrial anchor of the celestial and human hybrid race that had precipitated the near destruction of the planet. To the Amorites who worshipped him, he was a living god, a physical, breathing manifestation of the underworld kings who ruled from the jagged black necropolises of Bashan. He was a king of men, but his soul and his genetics belonged entirely to the abyss. He carried the weight of the drowned antediluvian world on his massive shoulders, standing as a towering 13-foot monument to humanity's darkest origins. And as the wandering, exhausted tribes of Israel approached the borders of his domain, they were not just preparing to face a massive warlord and his army. They were preparing to wage a cosmic war against an ancient immortal, a creature whose very existence defied the will of heaven, setting the stage for a psychological and spiritual confrontation so terrifying that it would require the direct intervention of the divine to prevent the total annihilation of the human race. The march toward the dark, jagged borders of Bashan was not a traditional military campaign. It was a march into the very mouth of ancient madness. As the Israelite camp, a sprawling sea of exhausted men, women, and children, turned their faces toward the fortress city of Edrei, an unnatural, suffocating quiet settled over the desert. Moses, the man who had stood before the burning bush, who had watched the Red Sea tear itself apart, and who had broken the spine of the Egyptian empire, suddenly stopped. For the first time in his long, miraculous journey, the great prophet was consumed by a profound, paralyzing dread. The ancient texts are highly specific about this moment of terror, noting that the divine presence had to explicitly whisper to Moses, commanding him not to fear the towering monarch waiting in the shadows of the basalt cliffs. But why would Moses, the architect of Pharaoh's ruin, require such desperate reassurance? The answer lies in the deeply unsettling realization that human weapons and conventional warfare are entirely useless against a creature whose biology and spirit were forged in the chaotic fires before the Great Flood. The terror gripping the Israelites was not merely the physical threat of a 13-foot giant. It was an intense, ontological horror, a deep-seated panic born from facing an entity that simply should not exist in the post-Diluvian world. Moses was not merely looking at a warlord. He was staring directly at a walking, breathing paradox, who possessed a terrifying spiritual armor known as merit or zechut. According to the deepest layers of Midrashic tradition, King Og was not a newly risen tyrant, but an ancient, wandering immortal. He was the anonymous fugitive who had somehow survived the brutal slaughter of the Rephaim centuries earlier, fleeing the bloodshed to embed himself deeply within the household of the patriarch Abraham. The texts reveal a chilling secret. Og had served in Abraham's camp, had eaten at his table, and most horrifyingly of all, had undergone the rite of circumcision, effectively grafting his corrupted Nephilim flesh into the peripheral protection of the divine covenant. Moses stood paralyzed by the math of the cosmos, looking upon a behemoth who had survived the boiling, apocalyptic waters of the Deluge, who had walked alongside the founding fathers of the faith, and who carried the sacred mark upon his monstrous body. How do you kill a monster that the universe itself seems to refuse to destroy? The dread of the Israelite army lay in the suffocating thought that they were marching to their deaths, tasked with executing a being who appeared utterly impervious to the judgment of heaven and earth. But the confrontation at Edrei was destined to be the definitive closing of the portal to the Nephilim era. A high-stakes genetic extermination executed by human hands under a strict divine mandate. As Og stepped out from the black gates of his city, he looked out over the Israelite encampment, measuring its sheer size at 3 parasangs, roughly 9 miles of vulnerable, fragile human life stretching across the valley floor. He knew that standard Bronze Age warfare, the clashing of bronze swords and the firing of arrows, was vastly insufficient for the scale of slaughter he desired. Leveraging the raw, untamed strength of his celestial and human hybrid bloodline, Og bypassed the armory and walked directly toward a massive mountain of solid rock that mirrored the exact dimensions of the Israelite camp. Imagine the deafening, apocalyptic sound of the earth's crust shattering, the violent tearing of ancient bedrock as the giant dug his massive hands deep into the stone foundations of the world. With a roar that shook the very air, he uprooted the entire mountain from the earth, hoisting millions of tons of jagged rock and soil high above his head. He intended to hurl this colossal mass down upon the valley, burying the entire Israelite nation and their covenant in a single, catastrophic, world-ending blow. The battlefield of Edrei was instantly plunged into a terrifying, unnatural twilight. The sky darkened, not with storm clouds or a barrage of arrows, but with the suffocating shadow of a 9-mile expanse of uprooted earth, held aloft by a single immortal entity. But as the giant prepared to bring the sky crashing down, the defeat of Og required a cosmic, rather than purely martial, intervention. Heaven did not respond with a thunderbolt or a pillar of fire. Instead, it answered with a swarm of the smallest, most insignificant creatures. God sent a massive swarm of ants and locusts to silently and rapidly bore through the very center of the suspended mountain. As the insects aggressively chewed through the stone and soil, the structural integrity of the massive weapon failed in a heartbeat. The colossal rock collapsed directly onto Og's massive shoulders, the center giving way so that his head was suddenly trapped within the crushing weight of the stone, locking the mountain around his neck like a suffocating, inescapable collar. What followed is recorded in the ancient texts as a sequence of cinematic, mythological body horror, a violent and permanent rejection of the Nephilim body by the natural world. As the immortal monarch thrashed blindly, attempting to tear the crushing collar of rock away from his throat, a grotesque physical mutation was forced upon him by the divine. God caused the giant's teeth to elongate violently, the bone jutting outward in both directions, slicing through his own flesh to embed deeply and permanently into the surrounding rock. Og was instantly paralyzed, gagging on his own blood, and locked inside the crushing embrace of his own weapon of mass destruction. With the immortal immobilized in this horrific state, the moment for the final cosmic closure had arrived. The Midrash reveals that Moses himself was a man of immense superhuman stature, standing 10 cubits or 15 feet tall. In a breathtaking display of physical power, Moses gripped a massive battle axe measuring 10 cubits in length, sprinted toward the flailing behemoth, and leaped 10 cubits into the darkened sky. With the combined momentum of his massive frame and the heavy weapon, Moses brought the axe down with cataclysmic force upon the only exposed part of the giant he could reach, Og's ankle. The blow shattered the foundation of the giant, severing the tendons and crushing the bone. The colossal monarch came crashing down to the bloody earth, his massive weight dragging the broken mountain with him to his ultimate death. The shattering of that ankle was the definitive sound of the door slamming shut on the age of monsters, ensuring that the last pure-blooded anchor of the Watcher lineage was finally and permanently erased from the terrestrial plane. You might think that the cataclysmic shattering of King Og's ankle at the blood-soaked Battle of Edrei marked the definitive end of the giant epic. You might find comfort in the belief that when that colossal 13-foot corpse finally crashed into the desert dust, the Nephilim bloodline was permanently extinguished, buried securely under the crumbling weight of a forgotten Bronze Age. But the death of a monarch does not mean the eradication of a genetic anomaly. The physical ripples of that dark, towering civilization did not stop at the jagged borders of ancient Bashan. They bled forward through time, haunting the periphery of human history and leaving physical breadcrumbs that modern institutions have allegedly spent over a century trying to aggressively sweep under the rug. Fast forward thousands of years from the scorched deserts of the Levant to the damp, fertile soil of the American Midwest and the deep, shadow-draped limestone caves of Nevada. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a bizarre and highly suppressed frenzy of archaeological discoveries swept across the United States. Local newspapers were absolutely saturated with sensational, terrifying reports of abnormally large human skeletons being pulled directly from ancient pre-Columbian burial mounds. Imagine the visceral shock of rural farmers and early antiquarians plunging their iron shovels into the earth, only to scrape against massive, heavy skulls that completely dwarfed their own. In 1916, an expedition in the Susquehanna Valley of Pennsylvania uncovered a staggering mound containing 68 skeletons, averaging a massive 7 feet in height, with some skulls exhibiting grotesque 2-inch bone protuberances, literal horns, jutting outward from their heavy foreheads. Other chilling accounts detailed enormous mummies, dragged from the dark depths of Lovelock Cave, and sprawling megalithic burial complexes on Catalina Island, holding the oversized remains of thousands. But you will not find these colossal bones resting in any brightly lit modern museum display. Fringe historians and researchers argue that these monumental discoveries were systematically and ruthlessly suppressed by the very people tasked with preserving our past. A persistent, chilling conspiracy theory posits that the Smithsonian Institution, under the iron-fisted directorship of Major John Wesley Powell in 1879, intentionally confiscated, hid, or outright destroyed thousands of these giant skeletons. The motive, theorists claim, was not scientific preservation, but ideological control. The academic establishment desperately needed to enforce a strict, uniformitarian doctrine of human evolution and aggressively uphold the manifest destiny narrative. They had to ensure that no physical evidence of a highly advanced, dominating, and terrifyingly large indigenous or pre-indigenous civilization could challenge the established, sanitized order of the modern world. The bones were allegedly locked away in dark subterranean archives, heavily classified and hidden from public view, leaving the terrifying legend of the giants to wither into the harmless realm of mere folklore and children's myth. But you cannot permanently hide a biological truth, especially when it is written in the code of life itself. In our contemporary digital age, the theological nightmare of the Nephilim is violently resurrecting itself, not through ancient, crumbling scrolls, but through the sterile, indisputable lens of modern paleogenetics. We are beginning to realize that the towering watchers of the Book of Enoch and the terrifying giants of the biblical record might actually be ancestral, deeply embedded memories of archaic, anomalous hominid species that walked the earth long before the dawn of recorded history. Enter the Denisovans, an incredibly robust hominid species identified not by complete skeletons, but by anomalous ghost DNA extracted from a single tiny finger bone found freezing in a dark Siberian cave. Fringe researchers and alternative historians propose a paradigm-shifting hypothesis: the sudden, inexplicable emergence of massive megalithic building cultures across the globe, from the dizzying, perfectly aligned stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe to the sprawling, mathematically precise earthworks of the North American mound builders, was not the work of ordinary, fragile, early humans. It was the direct result of ancient hybridization. When early humans interbred with advanced, large-statured Denisovans, or terrifying Neanderthal hybrids, they created a biological surge, a literal race of mighty men of old, who possessed the immense physical strength and the dark, esoteric architectural knowledge necessary to build monuments that mirrored the stars. In this chilling modern framework, the corrupted DNA of the giants is absolutely not of angelic, celestial origin. It is an archaic, heavily suppressed hominid lineage that never actually went extinct. The Great Flood was intended to be an apocalyptic, hard reset, a cosmic mechanism designed to mercilessly scrub the terrestrial hard drive of a deep, systemic corruption. Yet the anomaly found a way to endure. By clinging to the splintered, pitch-covered exterior of the very vessel meant to ferry uncorrupted humanity to a pristine new world, Og of Bashan proved that ancient chaos cannot be entirely drowned. He was the shadow of the antediluvian world cast incredibly long over our present reality. Whether you view him as the literal, terrifying descendant of fallen angels, the absolute apotheosis of a blood-drenched Amorite death cult, or the cultural genetic memory of an extinct giant Denisovan lineage, his survival represents humanity's profound, shaking unease with its own suppressed prehistory. The giants may have lost their heavy iron thrones and their volcanic fortresses, but their legacy proves that ancient chaotic genetics possess a terrifying, undeniable resilience that refuses to stay buried in the dirt. Which leads to a deeply uncomfortable truth. We look back at the ancient story of the Nephilim, and we instinctively imagine a clear biological boundary between us and the monsters. We tell ourselves that the Great Flood worked, that the cosmic sterilization was ultimately successful, and that the giants were utterly eradicated from the human story. But what if the greatest deception in human history is the naive belief that the contagion was kept entirely on the outside of the ark? The supreme irony of our existence is that the very anomalies we fear, the aggressive, world-conquering instincts, the dark obsession with forging weapons of mass destruction from the earth, and the insatiable, violent hunger to dominate our fellow man, did not die in those boiling waters. They survived because they were integrated. We think we have civilized ourselves, confidently trading jagged black basalt fortresses for towering, sterile glass skyscrapers. But that ancient, restless DNA wakes up every single time we build an empire or draw a sword. The Nephilim didn't just fade away into the fossil record. They dissolved completely into the human gene pool. They are the ghost sequence, hiding silently in the luminous strands of our own double helix. So, I have to ask you to look closely at the brutal architecture of our modern world and make a choice. Do you believe we are the polished, pure, and divine creation of a newly cleansed, post-flood world? Or are we the walking, breathing descendants of the contaminated survivors, forever carrying the violent ghost of the giants in our own blood? If you want to understand the terrifying truths still hidden in the blind spots of our history, you need to be here for the next chapter. Subscribe and prepare to witness what they buried next.